Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Tuesday, December 8th, 2020. Just want to point out, click on the notification bell in the upper right, the little bell up there, that icon. If you click on that, you'll become a subscriber and you'll be notified every time I have a new episode. Today's episode is about exploding a particular myth concerning Robert E. Lee. So let me pull up my notes and we'll get started. The most easily disprovable myth about Robert E. Lee is that his reputation was artificially created by selected ex-Confederates after the Civil War. Nonetheless, the myth is promoted by numerous authors, particularly in academia, who delight in throwing dead cats into a sanctuary of Southern heritage. Consider the following examples. Thomas Connelly wrote, quote, "Not until the 1880s would Lee be regarded as the South's invincible general," close quote. And that's 15 years after the war had ended. William Piston wrote, quote, "When he died on October 12, 1870, Lee was only one of a large number of Confederate heroes," close quote. Carol Reardon concluded, quote, "Virginians directed post-war efforts to recast Robert E. Lee as the great Confederate hero," close quote. Such statements as the three above are unsupportable. Pretending that the countless thousands of Southern remarks, if not tens of thousands, concerning Lee's stature during the war simply do not exist, well, that's just unbelievable. A few days after the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, for example, Lee joined the smallest sector of his army that had been only lightly engaged, but faced a much larger Federal force. The Confederates in this sector were frightened by the size of the opposing army. But after the general arrived, a North Carolina major described the relief when Lee showed up. Quote, "Suddenly, we saw passing through the woods General Lee. As soon as his face was well seen, the word raced down the line. All is well. Uncle Robert is here." There was no cheering, but the men leaned on their muskets and looked at him as though a god was passing by, close quote. Nearly a year later, when General James Longstreet's First Corps returned to Lee's Army of Northern Virginia after 8 months of duty in Georgia and Tennessee, they held a review for General Lee. This First Corps was composed of soldiers entirely outside of Virginia. The other two corps had many Virginians in them, but this one had soldiers from states as far away as Texas and Arkansas. And like I say, none of these were Virginians. Even though none of the corps soldiers were from Virginia, they showed Lee that they considered his army to be their home during the war. A South Carolinian wrote to his family, quote, "We had a grand review yesterday by the greatest of men, General R. E. Lee," close quote. Similarly, Longstreet's artillery commander wrote, quote, "General Lee reins up his horse and bares his good gray head and looks at us, and we shout and cry and wave our battle flags." There was no speaking, but the effect was that of a military sacrament in which we pledged anew our lives, close quote. 7 days later, the men marched into the Battle of Wilderness. The first units arrived just as Lee was facing the worst crisis his army had yet met. But the soldiers redeemed the moment. Overjoyed to see them, Lee was preparing to lead them on a charge against the Federal units that were on the threshold of breaking the Confederate line. He sat on Traveler in front of the men, but Longstreet's men would not allow him to remain. With shouts of "Lee to the rear," they turned their commander back, sweeping into the opposite woods by themselves to check the Federal advance. 18 months earlier, Francis Lawley of the London Times newspaper visited the Confederacy and observed Lee's courage during the Battle of Fredericksburg. Lee rode slowly along the lines. It would be presumptuous of me to say one word in commendation of the serenity or the unconscious dignity of the general's courage under fire, close quote. He possessed an antique heroism that bestowed utter disregard for danger. 3 months later, one of the Confederate surgeons in Lee's army wrote his children, quote, "I wish you all could see him. He is a most noble specimen of men, always polite and agreeable, and thinking less of himself than he ought to, and thinking indeed of nothing but the success of our cause and the return of blessed peace," close quote. Even near the end of the war, another British visitor and member of Parliament wrote, quote, "R.E. Lee is the idol of his soldiers and the hope of his country. The prestige that surrounds his person is the one idea of an entire people," close quote. That comment explains why the Confederacy collapsed after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, even though tens of thousands of soldiers remained in the field in other Confederate armies and other theaters of the war. Northerners were also favorably impressed by Lee. Henry J. Raymond, who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, an important advisor for President Lincoln, and the editor of the New York Times, wrote in the fall of 1864, quote, "The rebels have exhibited a most wonderful energy and skill. No people on earth ever made such a hard fight with such limited means. All candid men, whatever their hatred of the rebellion, are free to admit that the final triumph of our national armies will be due only to the superiority in numbers," close quote. Lee's status among civilians was equally high. In her Journal of a Success Lady, North Carolina's Kate Edmonston wrote, quote, "This constant anxiety and watching must tell on our men. How does Lee support it? God's blessing only, and God's strength enables him to bear up under the strain. What a position he does occupy, the idol, the point of trust, of confidence and repose of thousands. How nobly he has won the confidence and admiration of the entire nation." A third British observer, who was an officer in the Coldstream Guards and who visited 9 of the Confederate states, wrote, "Throughout the South, quote, throughout the South, all agree in pronouncing him to be as near perfection as a man can be," close quote. After the fall of Atlanta, Lee wrote the head of Congress's Military Affairs Committee in October 1864, urging that black volunteers be enlisted as soldiers. In January 1865, he replied to an unsolicited request for an opinion on the matter from an influential Virginia politician. He answered promptly that the South should employ blacks as combat troops, quote, "without delay," close quote. He also considered that emancipation, at least for the soldiers' families, was a necessity. He even recognized that such a measure must ultimately lead to general emancipation. After Lee stated his opinion, Congress authorized the recruitment of up to 300,000 blacks into the Confederate armies. President Davis stipulated that none would be accepted unless they volunteered and possessed manumission papers from their owners providing freedom. Since Lee was forced to surrender the following month, it was too late in the war to have an effect. The continual misrepresentations of Lee and the Confederate soldier are a prime cause of the vandalism, removal, and destruction of Confederate monuments and icons. Presently, it is less history repeating itself than the historians who spread such falsehoods, who repeat themselves out of ignorance, sloth, or malice. Regardless of their motives, any historian who proclaims that Lee only became popular after the Civil War has shown you his passport. He is a citizen of fantasy land. Okay. I would also like to, at this moment, show you a book that's going to cover some of Lee's remarkable achievements. The Confederacy at Flood Tide. This covers June 1862 to September of 1862. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June of 1862, and within 3 months, he had transferred the front of the war, the battlefront, to Maryland. Whereas when he took command, it appeared that Richmond was about to fall. If the book is available at all fine bookstores, as the typical comment goes, or typical promotion goes, you can get it at any bookstore, about Barnes and Noble. If they don't have it, they can order it for you. But you can also get it directly online from Amazon or Barnes and Noble or other stores that do have an online store. It is priced at $28 on Amazon. I will provide signed copies for $31, and if you're in the United States, I will cover the postage. So that will be $31 net to you, and I will cover the postage if you're in the United States. So that's our show for today. I'm going to be doing some more work on Lee. I may have some more videos coming up here about Lee. But I'm finding not only is it a fascinating topic, but it's a topic that needs consideration at this time, considering that the Virginia Military Institute recently took the Stonewall Jackson off their campus. There's just too much one-sided, biased narrative about the Confederate soldier and their leaders, most particularly Lee and Jackson. Well, there are others included as well. Nonetheless, that's our show for today. Thanks for watching, and come back again.